This video will show how I permanently mounted this 7-inch Android Auto car display into the stock radio location of a base model 2003 Toyota regular cab Tacoma. Because it only has 2 speakers, I was able to use this really cheap amplifier. The 7-inch Android Auto display is the BQCC B500A, which I reviewed in a previous video. It booted extremely fast and is fairly responsive. The sound output was also decent. As for the audio output amplification and control, I used this $7 soundboard fitted into the ashtray location. I bought this from AliExpress and the web listing claims it to be 200 watts. Now I'm being realistic and I'm not expecting it to be really 200 watts, but it did end up being very usable and the sound was good for the budget and application. Here's some scenes of it in use during a road trip. Cancel navigation. Navigate to the intersection of Inyo and Butt. The voice commands work. Here's the view from the driver's side. And now from the passenger side. I temporarily mounted a backup camera to the back bumper and that works as it should. I will have to find a more permanent location later as this is too low of a view. Let's get started on the install. Set your parking brake, chock your wheels, and disconnect the 12-volt battery for safety. Plastic parts, pieces, and connectors on old vehicles will be fragile and brittle. Use caution when manipulating. Not responsible for broken parts. First, I took the center bezel off the vehicle. This is a time-lapse version of the process. If you want to see the actual process, refer to a supplement video showing how to remove the bezel and the shifter cover. Let's get started on the install. This type of mounting requires some modifications to the display unit. Being mounted as shown means some of the inputs won't be accessible as is. For this application, I will need to reroute the backup camera input and the 12-volt power input as they push up against the sides of the opening. The auxiliary out audio jack does not have to be rerouted if you use a very low profile auxiliary cable like this one. It can fit through the gap on the side. However, I did notice that on this vehicle, the dash bezel has been modified by a previous owner. There used to be a lip on the side here. It seems to have been trimmed off. So if it doesn't fit, you might have to do some trimming of this side. Everything is behind the bezel, is not visible on the outside of the car, so it's not really a big issue. Now let's disassemble the display to get it modded and ready. This display unit has already been modded. I'm just using it for demonstration purposes. Luckily, the display unit simply pops off its back cover with some prying. Start prying from this side because of the ports and wiring are on the other side. Once you get a gap started, use a credit card or some other kind of pry tool and go around the perimeter to get it open. It flips open from the top of the display as there is a ribbon cable on the bottom. Be careful not to rip it. Disconnect the internal speaker connector and pry off the speaker itself as it's not needed and gets in the way of the install. You can see the insides are all very basic. Remove the screws. Carefully pry off the Wi-Fi adapter connector. Free up the board and have access to the solder points. Solder your 12-volt wires to the power points here. You can verify the positive and negative while it's plugged in with a multimeter. Be very careful not to cause a short. Do the same for the backup camera. Also verify with a multimeter. I measured resistance to see if the positive and negative matches. To reroute these wires, I drilled a hole in the back of the cover and ran the leads out the back. Now for mounting the display to the stock bezel, I had to drill 4 holes for the mounting bolts. These will be attached to some custom 3D printed brackets which will be attached to the factory bezel's top and bottom lips. I then positioned the bolts from inside of the cover. I used some hot glue and electrical tape to hold them in place and to prevent any electrical shorting if the wires came loose inside. Most likely this will not happen, but it's just a precaution. As mentioned earlier, there's not much mounting surface on the factory bezel to secure the brackets. After properly positioning the display, I bolted the brackets down with washers and nuts. Next, I secure the zip ties. So even though I don't like to resort to zip ties, I ended up using zip ties to secure them to the top and bottom lips. This vehicle seems like it was modified before, as I see a lot of trimming on the inside, so this is what I'm working with. With everything zipped up and bolted down, it's actually very secure and solid. Now for the little amplifier that I plan to fit into the ashtray area. I had to take off the metal bracket assembly. It's held on by 2 screws. And I had to make a 3D printed mounting bracket to fit it in there. I simply bolted it on using the original screws. Then I screwed on the amp using its front mounting openings. For the audio out to the amp, you can simply run the auxiliary cable under the ashtray opening to the front auxiliary jack. But if you want to make it look cleaner, solder it to the soldering points on the board itself like this. For the power and sound wiring, the display's 12 volt and amp's 12 volt will be tied to the stock radio harness with a typical Toyota radio adapter. We only need the 12 volt accessory wire, the ground, left, and right speakers. This being a base regular cab, there's only 2 speakers, so this setup works well. Now for putting it back into the dash, make sure the low profile auxiliary jack on the side is positioned this way so it fits through the gap on the side. Snap everything back into place and try it out. Now I know this is not going to have the absolute best audio quality, and there's a lot of different ways you can implement Android Auto into a cheap car. I was just interested to see if it could be done and how it would come out.